And for snapshot condition, snapshot, we say, okay, it is created, it is means it's cut, or it is available to use, or it failed. Those are like well-known states. And so they suggest to use regular field instead of a condition. So condition, that would be a list. You add one condition on when you have new conditions. And regular field would be much simpler and easy to construct. So,
so the at, does that include a timestamp that you're going to say when it is available, or would it be more simplistic to say?
Yes, for a created at, it is a timestamp. It is.
What about available at? What is that? I'm confused, but I guess mainly by the available at. So
available at is also a timestamp. It's the time when the snapshot is available.
Means how do we? Sorry, but how do we determine that? Is that if it's scheduled and then?
I think for some volume plugin, if there is no uploading phases, then created at and available at basically the same time. So when you create snapshot, it is when it's available. If the snapshot needs uploading, available at is normally a later time. And I checked for, let's say, GCE, it is there is creation timestamp. I think it is when the snapshot is created, but I need to double check the meaning of this creation timestamp. It could be when the snapshot is available. It has a timestamp. Otherwise, yeah, it is a little bit hard to determine. Basically, we periodically probe, like check what is your status of snapshot. And from CSS spec, it will return the state of a snapshot, whether it is uploading or it is creating, and or it is ready. And when you probe the status change to ready, then we can say at that moment when you check the status, that's the closest time you can kind of use for available at. I'm not sure I explained clearly or not. So,
Jing, so you're saying that GC may not have two different timestamps? One for when snapshot is cut, the other one when...
Yeah, there is only one timestamp. There's only one timestamp, yeah.
Hey, Jing, so when we were doing volume attachment object, the feedback that we got was don't do conditions. Conditions are not a good, they just weren't the recommended thing to do going forward for the Kubernetes API. This was from API reviewers.
Okay, perfect.
Right.
And so what they suggested to us was have concrete states in the volume attachment status object. So for example, we had the attached state, and then the challenge was, okay, having a Boolean indicating whether a certain state is achieved is nice, but how do you capture error? And for that, we added a generic volume error object, which allowed us to say timestamp and message for attach error or detach error. Is that something that was considered for this?
Yes, actually it's similar. So we have direct field. We can say, okay, created as a Boolean. So whether it is created or true or false. But because snapshot time is very important for user to know when, like it changed to like it's already cut or when it's available to use. So thinking about that point, instead of just have a Boolean, we can directly have a timestamp, like it's a pointer. And if it is new, then that means it's not yet created. So when the controller sets the timestamp, that means right, the status is changed. So if the created at is set, then that means the snapshot is cut. When the available at is set, the timestamp is set, then that means the snapshot is available. So that's, we think we, at one side, we indicate, okay, what is the status, right, by setting those timestamp, and the other side, also we gave user the information about when it happened.
Got it. Okay, so I was confused when it said conditions. I thought this was reusing the conditions thing.
No, yeah, we don't use condition anymore. It's just a field in volume snapshot status.
Yep, that makes sense.
Right.
Okay.
But the only thing, like as Eric mentioned, right, how we know when it's available. So right now, depends on the volume plugin. They might not have like explicit timestamp tell you both time, like when it happened. Like GC, we only have one called create timestamp. And then we probably only get one timestamp for these two conditions. Then the controller thinks it needs to keep probing, like checking the status of the snapshot. Right? And with the response of the CSI snapshot API, we know when it changed. So we say at that moment when you check.
So I think for most storage systems, it's going to be just one timestamp, right? Because most storage systems don't do the uploading, right? So the created at available at should be the same. For GC and AWS, that will be doing uploading. Yeah, so I'm wondering if you know two timestamp or just one, because otherwise we'll be waiting until it's uploaded, or how does?
Yeah, because controller, right? We'll just keep calling the CSI
right
list snapshot. So when the list snapshot give us snapshot status, and you see the status change to ready, then we set at that moment the timestamp as available at.
Okay, but there's also uploading status in the middle, right? So that we can also get that, right? So GC can return that one as well, right? So if it's already done, if snapshot is already cut, and you're doing uploading, then GC can return that as well, right? Because at that time it's no longer blocking the snapshot is no longer blocking, right?
Yes.
So,
it give you when it's uploading, right? It give you when you list the snapshot, get snapshot, it tells you right now it is uploading.
Okay.
So right now, yeah, go ahead.
So I guess what I'm a little bit unsure about is what the error handling situation is going to look like for the caller. So you have one failed at, you have one available at, and one created at. So created at and available at seem fairly obvious to me. Those are the two possible end states. And then failed at can be shared by either of them. So either during creation or during upload, either of those operations can fail, and that condition can be transient, meaning it can fail while it was doing creation, and then at some point later it can succeed the creation and then try the upload and fail during upload. And so if you have a single failed at, how is that going to be handled? Is it going to be always what the latest error was? Does it get cleared after a certain point? How does it work?
Right now, we also have a reason and a message similar to kind of condition structure. So you can put detailed information about the failure. So like when it's like error, you can say error in uploading, like failed in uploading or failed in creating. So we, in the status struct, right, besides created at, available at, and failed at, we also have
Can I ask a question about available at, please?
Right.
What use is the available at and failed at status or timestamps? I can understand created at, but everything else can be inferred from the status of the snapshot. And as was mentioned previously, sometimes they can get failed if storage runs out or the cow space runs out for the snapshot. Sometimes they're deleted and can fail later on in their life cycle. I don't see what the use of available at or failed at could be used for. I mean, you could get them from the events. What's the use case?
Oh, you mean failed at? So give a time when it failed does not matter much to users.
But we can get that from the events.
Yes.
And
yes.
it could be transient. And available at also is irrelevant because you've got that from the snapshot status. The snapshot is either ready or uploading or whatever, or pending.
So available at means just right now, okay, it is after this timestamp is set, we tell user basically, okay, your snapshot is ready to use. You can create new volume from snapshot. So we can have a Boolean to represent that, so change from not available to available, right, true or false. But I
mean, you could mirror the PVC claim, so it could be pending, and then once it's available, matching that.
So we
going away?
Avoid using phases. From what you described, it's more like a phases, right? You translate from like present from one phase to another phase, but that's actually something we kind of want to avoid. We don't want to use state machine states for these APIs because it's when you have new states, right? The system don't know how to handle those, and for these regular fields, like true or false,
But then you have a complicated state machine based on multiple fields. And when new fields occur, you have the same problem as new states.
Yeah, it is not clear to me either that we are using these created at, available at, just like phases. So initially it says created at.
Yeah, from user point of view, I think they care about when my snapshot is cut and when my snapshot is ready to use. So that's why we have these two timestamps for user, right? It's very clear for them to see, okay, when my snapshot, those two kind of important information for users.
Would we ever use these timestamps to fail it? So would we ever fail a snapshot that was in pending forever state?
Not
or
sure.
Are these just status?
So if pending, that means the controller just keep querying like what is the status of the snapshot, right? By using CSI list snapshot, for example.
If it's pending, then it's not being cut yet, right? So I think it's still pending.
Right. So I'm saying
we don't even have a timestamp yet. We don't even have the first timestamp yet in that case. If it's still at that stage, right? So, so before the snapshot is cut, it's going to be CSI. The plugin is not going to return, right? So it's going to be pending in that case. And then when that call returns, we will get the created at timestamp, right? And then depending on whether there is an uploading phase or not, if there's uploading, then the controller need to continue to call and then get the status, and then until the upload is finished, and then at that point it becomes available at. But if there's no uploading, then available at timestamp will be the same as created at.
I'm just wondering if we're going to get in a situation where we're going to be in a, you could have like some sort of denial of service or something where it's constantly trying to upload something and the controller can't ever accept another snapshot request because it's.
You can always take a different snapshot, right? It's just if you want to try to create the same snapshot, then you should get the same result, right? Because unimportant, right? But if you want to try to create a different one, it should always be able to.
Yeah, the CSS spec
I didn't know if we wanted to have some sort of timeout on the upload, I guess.
Oh, I think
timestamps to indicate.
Yeah, we can definitely have. Yeah, we do have the we do have a wait, right? We do have there's a waiting period. Right? If it's too long, then we will time out. Yeah.
Okay.
That could happen.
Right, but these aren't.
I mean, actually, is that really necessary? I think as long as the object exists, the system should continue to retry, right?
Forever?
Mm-hmm. That's what we do for other components in Kubernetes.
Does it?
There's exponential backoff, but it's not. It doesn't stop trying.
Okay, I thought there was a limit.
For snapshots, the controller design. Right now, we kind of agree snapshot is kind of special. User, when they create snapshot, it's just one-time thing. If it fail, we don't want to keep trying, and user might get unexpected snapshot.
I think the correct behavior would be to categorize the type of error that you get. If it is something which will never be able to be recovered from, then it makes sense to never retry again. But if it is some sort of transient error, then we should do exponential backoff and continue to retry. The general idea with the Kubernetes objects is that once they're created, the user is hands-off and the system should drive towards that state. And if there's something preventing that state from being achieved, whenever that is unblocked, then that state is achieved shortly thereafter. So if there's something that's preventing a snapshot from being created, and then that gets fixed at some point, then the snapshot should go through without user intervention.
So one thing is, because user normally, for snapshot, they freeze their application, and right after taking snapshot, they want to unfreeze. So if we keep trying, right, the user don't have the time to unfreeze, unless user can say delete the snapshot API object, and we don't try anymore. But the main thing is snapshot user do something before and after taking snapshot. That's the main reason we don't want to keep retrying. And you mentioned transient failure. It's probably a little bit hard to determine what kind of failure, which failure we should retry, which failure we cannot retry. Seems a little bit as and the last time we mentioned, we want to, the first version, like alpha version, we can just don't retry. And later we can have option for user to set the maximum number of retry. If the user set that number, that the controller can try, let's say, 5 times. If they don't set it, by default, we don't retry.
So I think there are 2 issues here. One is application consistent snapshots, which requires the application to be quiesced, and whether that's done by the application owner or by a Kubernetes controller. So that's one thing. Because if its application is going to be arbitrarily paused for a long time until snapshot succeeds, that can result in downtime and disruption to operations. So, but another issue is also scheduled snapshots. With scheduled snapshots, you want to take snapshot at specific points in time. For example, every night at midnight. With this type of snapshots, it doesn't make sense to retry until you succeed. You have a narrow window to take a snapshot, and you can defer it to later.
Yeah, that's also the.
So maybe we should talk about them, how we want to support these other use cases. So application consistent snapshots and scheduled snapshots.
Yes, right.
I think that's a good way to approach it. Ardalan, via use case, see how it would go through the flow.
Right now for the alpha version, we are saying we are more focused on on-demand snapshots, but definitely actually when it's available, a user can just have their own cron job to do the scheduled snapshot. So we should also consider those use cases. But
yeah, I think it's important not to try to boil the ocean. You need to understand that we're going to start with a very small use case that we believe is the basic primitive that we can then rely on to build higher level functionality. So things like snapshot cron jobs and scheduled snapshots, things like that, can be built on top of functionality that will allow you to trigger a snapshot on demand. So let's keep this focused and not derail it.
Yeah, I'm not saying let's boil the ocean now, but I'm saying we can. I mean, we talked about this actually last week. You were not here to talk.
Yeah, I missed that. Sorry.
What I proposed was using the snapshot class to specify whether retry makes sense for this snapshot operation or not. So we can have a field in the snapshot class for the user to specify whether they want to do retry or not. So it's quite flexible.
Instead of retry, I think within Windows you get a 10-second time limit for your creation of application. Within 60 seconds, you could get have a time within. So I want the snapshot to be snapshot within this time frame, and if not, fail it.
Yeah, that seems reasonable.
Right. So that's what we plan to do after this version, finish.
Okay.
We can add that features. Yes.
So it sounds like the plan of action is for the initial version, there is just a default behavior, and the default behavior is that the plugin will determine how long it's going to retry for.
The default behavior is don't retry.
Don't retry. Okay, so you get one shot, and if it doesn't work, it fails.
Right.
Then in the future, you're going to add in additional functionality. Either that's going to be some sort of retry count, or like Garth mentioned, some sort of retry until timestamp. And if the timestamp is before that, it'll continue retrying before that.
Yes.
And that functionality is additive and can be added on top of this.
Yes.
Okay. I could buy that.
Okay, great. Thank you. So.
But it might be worth calling out what Garth mentioned in the doc, that maybe it's not the max retries, maybe it's a future timestamp.
Right. So we'll put those proposal in the design doc. Yes.
Yeah, we already have the maximum retry count there. Yeah, so we'll add Garth's new comments there as well.
So now go back to status. So is created at, available at, still have concerns? Or I feel this is more like for users.
I definitely like this better than, I definitely like this approach better than what we had before, which was using conditions and phases together.
Yeah.
But we had conditions and true and false for each condition. So this is much cleaner. But still, I'm not clear how these are different than phases, because effectively we have a state machine here where a snapshot, first phase is created at, and then based on whether we have the uploading phase or not, we have the available at, and then.
So these states are not mutually exclusive, right? So I think that one difference is you can have both created at and available at, right? Because after you're done uploading, you got the created at, but you also have available at timestamp.
Yeah, before we have something.
Sure, but these are like phases. We have a snapshot taking the creation phase and uploading phase.
I think phases are the mutually exclusive, right? So you go from one phase to another, but you can't have both. I think this one actually you can have both.
So those information, I mean, you can infer like what is the state right now. So like I said, when you set, but there is nothing set, then your snapshot is still pending over. And then when the created at is set, right, it is already cut. And it depends on whether the available at set together or not. If the available at is not set, right, right now it is not available yet, right? It is uploading. And when the available at is set, it is ready to use. So I feel those information is for user point of view, right? Very clear what.
But if we had failure of the snapshot in later time, do we set available at? Do we blank that out? So if in case a snapshot fails later, so cow space runs out or something, and newer snapshots are taken, which invalidates older snapshots, do we set failed at and then blank out available at? Having just one condition
the created at, I don't think we need to
created, available, and failed allows cycling and changing of the status.
So if the created at is already set, you don't need to change it, right? That means the snapshot is cut, and somehow like uploading failed, then you set.
I think Garth's argument is that if in the future, let's assume that both created and available succeeded at some point, but at some future point, the snapshot suddenly is not available any longer. Something happened, it got corrupted, it got deleted. Does the controller come back and modify the available at, clearing it out to indicate that it's no longer available, and setting failed at to indicate that it was it's actually now failed?
Right now, we don't have that logic. Like after it's available, we no longer check the state of the snapshot. I don't know how it is possible. So basically, the controller, after available at is set, the controller won't touch the snapshot anymore, right?
Yeah, I think theoretically it is possible. You could have a controller that would monitor the state after it's created and update the object. I don't think that's strictly necessary, but it could be nice to have additional functionality we can add in the future.
Right, like volume, I don't think we check the volume corrupt or not. Maybe it's not similarly, right? After the volume is created, we don't need.
I mean, we have issues with, for example, a volume that we think is attached is no longer attached after a certain point. So we have logic that goes in and verifies whether that is or is not the case.
That is for attachment. It's not for volume itself, right? It's like snapshot and volume, but attachment is different for volume itself. We don't check volume itself whether later it is failed or something. After the volume is created, right, it is created.
Right. But the idea is similar. It's just that after we think a certain state is achieved, we could potentially continue to monitor it to ensure that it doesn't deviate from that state. I think overall, in the grand scheme of things, that's relatively minor. The most important thing for us is making the snapshot available at a given point. And then once it's available, any additional checking that we do is a nice to have. It's non-critical.
Sure, yes. So we have some like explanation at the each like created at, available at. If it's not clear, like we can definitely revisit it. But the overall, this status, right? We don't want to use condition. I think we're more like agree with that. And we use directly fields. And whether we should use, like say, true or false for some state or timestamp, I more prefer to use timestamp for each state because time is important and useful for user. They can know like when their snapshot is taken, so they can take action.
I have a question. It's Shai. When the snapshot failed, what is the expectation from the customer to do? The next step is to delete the snapshot, or there is any way to change it?
Yeah, right now, since system won't do anything about failed snapshot, the user, if they want to, let's say, try later, right, they can delete the failed snapshot since it's not useful, right? You cannot do anything with it. And,
okay, so
yeah.
Okay. So right now, if it fails, you have nothing to do.
The controller won't do anything for failed snapshot.
Okay.
So it just give you when it failed, what's the reason, or like some detailed message. Yeah.
Okay.
So when I'm creating a snapshot programmatically, I would have to monitor available at and failed at and perform various things. Basically, I'd have to monitor the two fields.
Yeah, I think the behavior should be that if created at is set, then you can assume that creation has succeeded. You don't need to take a look at failed at. If available at is set, then you can assume that it's available and you don't need to look at failed. If either of the two is not set, then you should be looking at failed at to try and understand what happened.
Okay.
And there's an implied order of operations between the two, meaning if neither is set and a failed at shows up, then it indicates that it applies for creation, not for available. And as soon as created is set, then failed at applies for available. So it's the responsibility of the controller that's going to be setting it to clear the failed state if a retry forces created to succeed, which is a little bit funky, but I think it works.
I mean, comparing this to the PVC claim, we just wait for it to go into succeeded. And we know the PVC claim has succeeded and it's pending while it's doing its stuff. We know it's... yeah.
So PVC, we have phases like bound, right? You mean the PV or PVC? So for PVC, it is pending, bound, available. No, actually,
yeah.
PVC.
So you could have created, available, or failed as a phase, and then you don't need.
Yeah, so we kind of want to avoid using phases.
But you have phases already implicit in these fields, and now you have three things to check instead of one. You haven't avoided phases at all. You just have spread them across different fields.
I think the difference is here we can have created at and available at the same time. So it's not like in the PVC case, you transition from one phase to another. You wouldn't be at two phases at the same time, right? But here, you could be, it's already cut. So
why do you need the two at the same time?
Oh, because it's already cut. Then that's, then that's created at, right? And then it becomes available. That's after uploading. Then we set it as available at.
Yeah, I think the logic behind this, and I'm not an expert on the API, but my understanding is, if you have essentially an enum of states, then when a new enum value is introduced, existing controllers no longer know how to operate on that new value. Whereas if you have each state essentially as a discrete field, then you could have existing controllers continue to understand the existing states and only not understand any new fields that are introduced. So for example, in this case, we have creation and available. As long as existing controllers understand creation and available, even if a third state is added here, as long as created and available are set correctly, they'll be able to operate correctly without having to operate on that, whatever that new field is.
But the controllers also set the status and phase of the volume. So if they don't have a new phase or don't need that new phase or don't understand it, they don't need to set it.
So it's not necessarily the setter, it's also the consumers. Ideally, this API, with Kubernetes, the API is supposed to be transparent. Anybody can read and write from it. So someone who is using the state to do something, so it may be that the controller has been updated to understand the new phase, but some consumer that is monitoring this has not been updated. They would not be broken in this if it's structured in this way rather than an enum list.
So for
Okay.
I guess, maybe like a follow-up. Maybe we can capture this information on the volume snapshot content object, because this only matters to the controller, and to the user we can only show the single field, the single phase field that they're used to, which is easy because they don't really care about how these transitions happen. This makes sense only for the controller to understand.
Related to user, when they want to take a snapshot, right? They use volume snapshot as a handler. Right? User can only see volume snapshot. They cannot see volume snapshot content. So they don't know when they should resume application.
Right, but if the users only see, for example, I'm not advocating this, I'm just being devil's advocate. Basically, they just want it's more straightforward for them to see a single field instead of combining multiple fields, seeing what happened, what didn't happen. If they see, for example, there's a single field that they monitor the same way they monitor PVCs.
Right.
More user-friendly for them.
Yeah, but I think it still needs two things, right? The user care about when they resume application and when they can start use that snapshot to create volume. There's still two.
Right. So
they care.
So we have a single phase on the volume snapshot object, but there are these three fields on the volume snapshot content object.
I was wondering if we can have something like, we just call it like created, not available, created and available, so that we know exactly, just to look at this.
No, I think that ends up doing exactly what the purpose of avoiding an enum is, because then you end up with this exponential like number of possibilities, and if you introduce another one, you have to. So I think it's the interface here is a little bit ugly, but unfortunately, both pieces of information are necessary for the consumer. So I don't agree that it should be moved to content. I think it's required on the snapshot object itself. I think it's ugly, but it's okay the way it is. The one big piece of feedback that I would have is actually not having failed at reason and message as separate fields, but to take a look at what already exists in the volume attachment object and reuse that, which is volume error. Which does something very similar, just reuse that struct instead of inventing a new one here.
Okay, that's good. We definitely can check that. And yes, so we do want to simplify, but it's really hard. So for many volume plugin, if they don't have any, let's say, uploading phases, they can just check available at. They don't need to check two, right? So because those two will be also set at the same time. And
would we consider, sorry, consider making it available as a Boolean?
The Boolean, that's possible. So
does it need to be a timestamp?
Yeah, it's possible. I'm just thinking timestamp is maybe useful for user to check, how long it takes to cut my snapshot and how long it takes to uploading my snapshot, and they can get an idea. Like
that's more for metrics exposure, though, isn't it? That's
okay.
I think ultimately having the timestamp fulfills. It basically acts as a Boolean. If you don't want to use the timestamp, you don't have to. I know that it's pretty much a requirement for created at. I agree with available at. It's not really necessary, but for the sake of consistency, I don't know. I could see it as like not that big a deal.
So I don't know whether from user point of view, they prefer Boolean value so they can easily to check the states. Or timestamp.
We have both, right? If you, we can go back to what we had before, have a struct that has created as a Boolean and a timestamp, right? Both. Would that be better?
Non-null of available at and failed at, I can treat it as a Boolean, can't you, pretty much?
Yeah,
so,
it doesn't make sense to have two. If you can use a timestamp as a Boolean.
All right, sure.
So one other option, just like have create available as Boolean, and just have one timestamp called last transition timestamp. But you lose your previous information, like when it's...
Yeah, we do need the created at least, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think created at is important.
Okay, so right now we basically keep as it is, except the reason message, we will change that. And so since we've spent a lot of time discussing it, we can, like people can make comments on the like design PR. So I think we can move on.
Yeah, if someone could document the straight transition that Sally was mentioned about the created at, what gets set when, and
okay, you mean just add the documentation like what those timestamp, like the meaning and how relate to states transition?
A state flow diagram almost, yeah, transition.
Okay, sure. That we can do, yeah.
That would be good as an example, so it's clear to me when I'm building.
Okay. Okay, sure. Yeah, we will do that and update it. And let's move on. I think, another thing, since we need to restore snapshot to volumes, and right now we propose to have a data source struct in the PVC. And before, like we mentioned, like that suggests we can have a type and name. So it's very general. When you have new type of data sources, we don't need to change the API anymore. So, in that case, actually, we do have some API object already for this purpose, called object references or local object reference. So because basically you reference one object to another in the API. And the local object reference just have a name, because local, it means it will, you know what the type, and you know the namespace will be the same. For example, PV point to PVC, right? You know it is PVC, and you know it is, no, actually PVC is object reference. You need to know the namespace. There are some other use local reference because you don't need to put namespace. They will use the same. And for our case, a little bit different is if we use local, right, then we lose the type information. If we use object reference, a little bit too much, because currently we don't want to support cross namespace yet. If we directly use object reference, user can, for example, just refer to another namespace, snapshot, and then we have more work to like validate and checking whether it is cross namespace or not. We kind of want to avoid that in the first phase. So as Tim mentioned, we can add a new local object reference called typed local object reference. So you can specify a type and a name. We also have similar struct in API. I think it's something called a secret object. So that secret object requires a name and I think a namespace. So that we don't want to use the general object reference because it could contain a lot of information. We don't want to allow user to just specify randomly.
Hey, Jing, I thought last time we discussed we wanted just to add a kind in
that's
the local
a
object.
second option. We modify the local object reference to add a kind. But the problem is then for everything, right, you add a kind.
That's optional, right? So it should be okay for the
optional, but for local object, it's already have the meaning of, you know, the type. So we don't want to like add more meaning to local object reference.
Okay, so you say it's better to add a different.
Yeah, it's
object.
better to probably create a new one. We don't want to change directly to the local object reference. Yeah.
Okay.
Hey guys, I just wanted to ask about this too. So we're definitely not targeting cross namespace usage at first, but I do think that eventually we want to solve the problem. Are we painting ourselves into a corner with this design, or do we think that we'll be able to do that at a later time without paying technical debt for this?
Yes, I think I asked Tim also about this question. So maybe we can call it just typed object reference. So it should be okay if we add namespace later in that new API object. So right now we only have name and kind. And later when we like ready, start cross namespace, we can add namespace in that object. It is optional. So it does not have.
We need to be very careful about ever going across namespaces. Namespace boundaries exist for a reason, and we need to be very careful if we're going to violate them. I think the idea of having volume snapshots or volumes being able to be moved across namespaces is an important scenario. It's an important use case, but one that should require explicit consent from the user that holds that volume snapshot and the cluster administrator. And it should be a separate operation independent of these snapshotting or any other volume specific functionality. We don't need to pollute the volume snapshotting API or other volume APIs with cross namespace stuff. Those things can be added on top as separate cluster admin operations.
Yes, so I think we definitely need more time to think about and design it. So at least currently, we are not ready for supporting that. So for this data source, we just want to allow name and kind. Any other feedback about this data source? So right now, data source also we only allow snapshot. So later, if let's say clone, we start working on clone, and then another PVC could be a different data source. PVC could be different kind of volumes, and user might also use this if they can create a CRD for their own data source. Is also possible.
I have another question too about, basically I'm just wondering if we need for the data source, so we're declaring an intent for the PVC to be populated from that particular source. Is there a scenario where that population was unable to happen for some reason, but yet we still have the PVC, and now we need to communicate to the user that, or at least inside the cluster, that this hasn't reached the desired state yet? I don't know if that's clear.
A good point. Yeah.
Sorry, can you say that again?
So you've declared on your PVC that the data source should be a particular snapshot.
Right.
So that's the intent on the object. If the components are unable in the beginning to achieve that, for example, the snapshot provisioner or the snapshotter is not running at the time that this PVC is being bound, or something like that, could there be a situation where the PVC would get created with an empty content instead of what you asked for?
Oh, okay. So yeah, that's a good point. And I think we could add a check, like whether the snapshot is already available. So basically, available at time stamp already set or not. If it is not set, we can fail that operation to fail to create the volume if the snapshot is not available yet.
So where does that logic live in the system, the checking for that?
Right now, I think the PV controller will issue the create volume, and each volume plugin will do the provision. And those provisioner can check at that moment before they provision volume, can check if the data source is snapshot and the snapshot is not available.
What if they don't support snapshots?
Then it's also failed provision. They can return error
But if they don't know about snapshots or the data volume or the data source at all, they might not know to check that, and they might not know to fail the operation in that case. I'm just wondering if this is if maybe it's an invalid scenario because I'm not understanding something correctly, but if I write myself a brand new provisioner and then I get a PVC that asks for a snapshot, my code probably won't have any logic in there to fail.
Controller should have some check there to see whether it is supported, whether snapshot is supported or not. So controller can...
I think the argument here is you have an external provisioner that today doesn't understand the concept of I have a volume source. volume source is a new field on PVC. And what happens if this external provisioner goes and provisions a volume that is not actually pre-populated? I think that problem exists for PVCs in general, or external provisioners in general, because new fields can be added to the PVC object that the external provisioner is not aware of. And if it changes default fundamental behavior of that object, the old provisioners have no way of handling that correctly. We have that problem today. I don't know if we're going to be able to come up with a solution for it.
So I was just thinking the way we did this with the annotations is we had like a confirmation annotation. So I just wonder if maybe the volume, the data source or the volume source spec could have the requested type, and then maybe like a
that's a good idea
timestamp or something where you fill that in if you satisfy.
Or how about the PV object has a corresponding volume source, and if you have an external provisioner that didn't understand the volume source, they would provision a PV without that volume source field, and new provisioners that understand it and do the proper thing would set the volume source on the PV object.
I just wonder if then you would have something, maybe you could inhibit the PVC from being bound to the PV.
Right. If it wasn't correctly set.
Yeah.
I like that.
I think, we can probably add that logic, and we need to add.
Who was that, by the way?
This is Adam.
Adam, cool. Thanks.
And we can definitely add to our design doc relate to that point. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. So it's already past 10. I think we have someone when review the API, they mentioned something related to snapshot lifecycle, because currently in our design, snapshot is basically totally independent of PVC. So if PV deleted, snapshot is still there. But for someone plugin, it might have problem because if the original data deleted, the snapshot might not available anymore. But current design does not consider that yet. So I think in the next phase, we should definitely address that problem. We can also start discussing that, but today we don't have enough time, so we can continue to discuss in the next meeting. So yeah, again, I put all the links, so please review it and let us know any questions, problems. So it's ends for today. So thank you so much for all the comments and feedback. Yeah. See you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.
Cheers, guys.
Bye.